Today we're going to work on a Gary Fisher Tarpon early 2000s aluminum series frame. I always like working with Gary Fisher since I own one, but this customer said, can you fix this up and restore it back to a rideable condition, even though it was rideable, so to speak. Definitely seen some age, as you can see from the collection of grime and some sort of an alkali something residue that's all over the bike. Definitely wanted to investigate that, clean that up. The chain's not in the best condition, the derailleurs are not looking the best, tires, fork, pretty much everything on the bike has some amount of dirt and stuff that's on there that shouldn't be there. And not to really go too deep into what I think I can do right now, it's more than anything just restore everything. If you notice the wheels themselves, there's grease leaking from the front fork, which will need to be completely reconditioned, fixed up so that it runs. As you can see, there's missing some brake shoes, as well as the rear brake has the brake shoes installed upside down. So obviously there's significant amount of work that needs to be done on this bike. So one of the first things I do when I am breaking down a bike is to remove the wheels, because obviously they do get in the way of pretty much everything else I do. Since they are autonomous, they're easy to remove. That's the first thing I will do. Strangely enough, the front wheel did have a bit of a problem, only because of the fact that it was pretty stiff to remove the quick release skewer. So I needed to use some channel locks to remove it. From there, I took off the rear derailleur. Because this chain had the missing link, then it was an easy removal of the link so that the chain came off instead of actually having to break the chain. The chain was not in the best of conditions. I'm seriously considering not actually replacing the chain, but I will clean it up a little bit just to see how it looks once I get the grime off it, see it, with the actual bare metal if I can. From there, I took off the crank and the bottom bracket. As always, this is a bit of a chore because of so many pieces that need to be removed, as this is a 3-piece crank. Also, this is a cartridge or sealed bearing bottom bracket. Although not my favorite, I was a little bit skeptical if it was really worth keeping or not, but more on that as I start to investigate pieces later. When removing something like the bottom bracket, it is always smart to have the right tools to perform the operation you need, because if you do not, you can either damage the piece or struggle in making it work. As always, I have my hack of being able to get the bottom bracket cartridge out by using my PVC pipe as an extension of my adjustable wrench. That is exactly what I used, and it was actually pretty difficult to get off. I didn't expect it to be that difficult, but it actually was. It was because of the leverage that I needed to be able to remove it. Of course, I was using a little bit of penetrating oil. I used my PB blaster for this occasion. At times it may seem like I'm going in the wrong direction when I'm trying to remove the bottom bracket, but actually it is because it is a left-handed thread, and therefore needs to be twisted in the opposite direction to loosen it up. I actually had to resort to my mallet because I couldn't get the right leverage with my PVC, and it looks now more like I should have kept the wheels on and tried to do it on the ground. I probably would have had better success. I finally did get it to break free, but man, it took a lot of effort. I finally had to resort to a breaker bar that had an extended handle, and that was the only way I was able to get this thing off. I've never had the PVC pipe not work in it, but in this case, strangely enough, I just needed a different way to get the leverage.
I then moved on to removing the front derailleur, and once that was removed, started in on the handlebars. So when I'm removing handlebar grips from a mountain bike, they're pretty stuck on there. What I'll do is use an awl or a spoke to kind of introduce a little bit of a gap between the handlebar and the grip itself, and with a little bit of penetrating oil, I'll just stick it in there to kind of loosen it up. If they're really stuck on there, it does take some work because you have the smallest amount of gap in order for that penetrating oil to get in there, obviously, because that's the whole point of having penetrated oil, right? But once you do get enough in there, it will actually slide off, but can take a little bit of time. You have to be patient and work at it to get that off. From there, I started in on the shifters and brake levers, of course the drifters, I guess you want to call them that for mountain bikes. Another hack I use for this is the fact that because most bikes have been dumped or spilled, the handlebars always get banged up on the ends. Then it creates a little bit of a ridge. It mushrooms the ends a little bit. I mean, just so slight, but because the tolerances are so small, I will use a flathead screwdriver to open up the clasp just a little bit more so that it can get past that. I will also, if I don't want to do that necessarily or it's too much, I will use a file to file down that ridge on the end of the handlebar, and that will allow me to then usually get it past without scraping up things too much, because they can be a little bit tight at times. From there, I started in on the stem and removed the 4 bolts, the 2 that hold on the handlebar and the 2 that hold the stem onto the steer tube on the fork. Again, because of the age of this bike, I had to be a little bit careful with those bolts. I don't want to put undue torque on the bolts because I can shear the bolt, which is not typical because of the aluminum stem, but I can strip it rather quickly as well, and that is something that I do not want to do on a bike. I did not remove the front brake off the fork initially, forgot about it, but I figured I would remove that when I started working on the fork. I then started to remove the cups on the headset by smacking it with an old breaker bar that had broken years back. My ball peen hammer, usually a couple good wraps with this will get it to come off. From there, I started in on the rear brake, and of course, as I show here, the brake shoes were upside down, and it was not the best idea, obviously, but again, just another detail to what needs to be done to fix the bike. And finally, I removed the seat post and the seat clamp, and then once I had removed those two, I went ahead and took off the rear derailleur hanger, and at this point I was down to the bare frame. So for the frame preparation and cleanup, I typically will start with either the penetrating oil, mineral spirits, something to remove the grease, anything that is oil based, something on polar is something I would want to remove. Typically that's the first thing to come off because usually that will film over anything else that's below it. That's typically the situation. So once that has been cleaned up and removed, then I'll start attacking it with something that is not too damaging to the finish. For the most part, isopropyl alcohol usually is a good solution for removing other things like dirt, Gatorade, spills, something like that. Then the alcohol is polar and will help remove most of that. Once I have that off, then we have this alkali, whatever thing it was. Again, it looks like it just was maybe something salty, and the alcohol does take quite a bit of that off. So then I will have to resort to something more abrasive. I will then use my fine steel wool and just lightly brush it, not too much so I don't attack the clear coat underneath it. I don't want to get through that. Again, not looking for a showroom quality here. It's really just about getting it clean and getting it to the point where it's ready for restoration. As a final touch, I went over the entire bike with a polishing compound to take out any swirls or minor scratches that could have occurred with the fine steel wool application. That will give it a shine, as well as maybe remove some of the very minor scratches, not to create undue time and effort for this, but at least to give it a little bit more of a shine. Okay, so I was able to save myself a little bit of time by just taking off everything, all the
all the junk and everything from the head tube all the way down to chain stays and all that stuff. I just attacked this thing with my little bit of steel wool, a little bit of acetone, as well as my buffing solution. Basically just as if this were a car, and it shined up pretty nicely. It really not that bad at all. I'm sure it's got its dings and scratches and stuff like that because obviously it has been used, but overall it does actually look pretty nice. So I don't think I even need to put a third coat on this thing because of the fact that it really is not that bad. I mean, it just, it has to be. I mean, I'm expecting this to be fantastic. But close enough that at least it looks much better, cleaner, it's got a little bit of shine to it now. Not bad at all. So I'm going to start to put this thing back together and let's see how it turns out.
So the first thing I did was look for some replacement square taper axle bottom bracket. After looking at several candidates, I didn't find one that had the same axle length as the original cartridge one, so I determined that it would be better to just inspect the current one and see if maybe it's okay. So I removed the seal bearings. Didn't see them as being necessarily overly bad, especially once I got them off the axle. So I decided just to put them back together, put them back on the bike. From there, I went ahead and started to add the seat post with the clip, the rear derailleur hanger as well, to kind of fill out the last that I consider being the frame components. Now I started in on probably the hardest part of the rebuild, the suspension fork. This was an early version of the SR Suntour M2025 spring-loaded fork that had, just like the rest of the bike, been neglected. The owner had tried to add some white lithium grease to help preserve the spring action of the fork, but the rust on the stanchions and the lack of internal lubrication did not do much. I first removed the front brake with the missing brake pads. I knew that I had to replace those later. I then worked on removing the dust seal and adjustment cap to expose the spring and internal mechanism. I removed the spring and inspected it for any damage. I didn't see anything wrong with it, just age basically. I tacked the fork by creating a weird contraption of combining a long hex key with a 1/4-inch ratchet and an extension to reach the bolt holding the stanchions and lowers together. Because the bolt was so far down the lowers, I had to resort to using a flashlight and sighting the placement of the hex key, otherwise it was like shooting in the dark. I finally removed the bolt and tapped the stanchions off the lowers with the mallet. Once I had the fork disassembled, I thought that it wasn't too clean, so I attempted to perform an upgrade. I had a couple other Suntour suspension forks approximately the same age, and looked at possibly scavenging some of the parts off of one of them, but after disassembling the replacement fork, I discovered the crown was a different width. I also attempted to remove the brake posts from the original fork, only to learn that they were welded on the frame and therefore unrecoverable. I had to return to just restoring the original fork without making any improvements or replacements. Continuing with my cleaning, I removed the retaining clips, cleaned the stanchion seals as best possible, then cleaned the lowers. I then cleaned the dust boots from the accumulated dirt and dried grease. From there, I removed some of the junk inside the crown and the rust and corrosion on the stanchions as much as I possibly could with my Dremel, some steel wool, and even some emery cloth. It wasn't perfect, but did allow free travel of the stanchions in the lowers. I cleaned the retaining clips, plunger, and the spring to finalize the internal cleaning process. I then started by lubricating the stanchion seals with fork lube, and with normal grease lubricated the plunger and spring. Now here's where things got a little interesting. I was reassembling the fork, but for some reason I had this part I was uncertain of where it fit in the fork. I thought I had everything, but for some reason I couldn't find where it was as part of the assembly. It didn't seem to fit on the spring side, so I assumed it fit on the other stanchion, but for the life of me I couldn't figure out how. It was here that I started doing some research, which probably I should have been doing from the beginning, and found an exploded view drawing of the same fork. I then discovered that I had inadvertently confused some extra part to another fork as part of the original. I was relieved but somewhat chagrined that I didn't figure it out earlier. From there, the assembly was relatively easy. I lined up the plunger with the bolt hole on the lower and reconnected the stanchions with the lowers. I dropped the grease spring into the left stanchion and tightened the adjustment cap. I added some more fork lube to the exposed stanchions. I tapped on the dust cap on the opposite stanchion and checked the bounce. Much smoother. I did a final cleaning and confirmed the fork was in good working order. With the hardest part out of the way, I then concentrated on cleaning the headset. I've done these many times, therefore this process was simple. The bearings were semi-sealed, so being able to completely service them was a little difficult, only because I cannot easily remove the old grease in the cages. The seals and spacers were easy to clean, and the bolt on the head cap was barely corroded. I dropped the bearing assemblies in my trusty mineral spirits to remove any quick junk, and with a few rotations, felt that they were clean enough to repack. After a liberal application of grease to the bearings, I started the headset installation. Even though I have a headset seating tool, I found it is easier and as effective to simply bang them on with my mallet. All I need to do is confirm that they have seated well, and that's about it. Once the bearings are on the head tube, I slipped the fork steerer tube up through the head tube and added the crown seal and spacers. I didn't have the stem ready just yet, so I put the head cap on temporarily. I continued with cleaning the stem, which was not in a bad shape, just a little dirty and corroded from the years. I cleaned and lubricated the bolts, and that was about it. I returned to the bike and removed the cap and added the stem. I eyeballed the stem since I don't have the handlebars on yet, but usually fine-tune the alignment once the bike is finished. Next was the crank. It was dirty as always, but not too bad. I used my wire brushes to get past some of the teeth on the crank, but usually some mineral spirits and a rag are the best cleaner. As is common with the riveted cranks, the hardest part to reach is in between the chain rings. I don't always get the luxury to disassemble the crank completely. Regardless, I still can get in there with a long bristle brush that was designed specifically for cleaning chains and chain rings. Once I remove most of the junk, the crank actually looks rather good. I didn't bother removing the pedals like I typically would, only because they weren't in bad shape, and I will cut corners when I can. I did clean them a little with the light pass with my Dremel tool and my shop towel soaked in mineral spirits, just so they looked better than they did before. The installation was straightforward as usual. I will grease the spindle of the bottom bracket and then tighten on the two lock nuts. Once I was able to install the crank, it did rotate well. I was glad I didn't try to ditch the original cartridge bottom bracket. Next was the rear derailleur. Caked with white lithium grease, the derailleur also needed a good breakdown and cleaning. When servicing a rear derailleur, I like removing the idler pulleys because they usually are overlooked during a normal cleaning.
It is slightly dangerous as the spring that creates tension on the chain does tend to smack knuckles, and that hurts. For that reason, I will usually jam something in the pulley cage like an Allen or hex key so it doesn't move during cleaning. This is where my favorite tool is a Q-tip soaked with mineral spirits. It is small enough to get down in the hard to reach places and doesn't scratch or mar the derailleur finish. For the polishing, I will use my Dremel with a wire brush that, although deceptively small, can do amazing work on the metal parts. I soak the idler pulleys and bushings to get them really clean. I will normally use my grease, but at times I will use some other lubricant that may not be too thick so that the movement is not quite so restrictive. The reassembly is relatively straightforward. Because this was a rear derailleur with different sized idler pulleys, I had to make sure that I placed the larger one on the bottom to keep the design in order. Another reason for extending the idler pulley arm is because the pulley axles are difficult to install with the spring retracted. Once I was happy with the cleaning, the reinstall was simple. I don't need to do much than simply reattach the rear derailleur to the hanger and then start in on the front derailleur. Similar to the rear derailleur, the front derailleur had years of dirt and that alkali stuff spattered on the chrome, or at least that was the most obvious. Nothing new here, just age and neglect. Cleaning is performed with a Q-tip and some minor scrubs with a wire brush and the Dremel. As is well known for any restoration project, the removal of corrosion, accumulated dirt, and grime is what brings out the shine in any bike. I guess that is the real motivation for why I do this, is because I see the transformation of something that was ugly, for lack of a better word, to something beautiful, or for something broken to something functional. Regardless of how you may see it, this is a process that once complete is truly remarkable. This time I used my Ryobi tool for cleaning that has a smaller wire brush that is amazingly effective at reaching those difficult places in a derailleur. I bought this on a whim, I guess, but it has been indispensable in some of my projects. As with the rear derailleur, I also use a hex key to open it up a little so I can access the places that are normally not reachable. Unfortunately, the dirt, water, residue, and other debris can find its way there, so I need to find some way to remove it. The installation was easy and uneventful. Care must be taken so that the derailleur aligns with the crank and should just clear the largest chain ring when extended. Usually that's all that's needed as far as installation is concerned. I deal with the limits later. I then moved on to the handlebar. Although not in this video, I had cleaned it so it would shine like new. Had it been more rusted, I probably would have repainted. However, I didn't feel that it was necessary this time. Now I started in on the brakes. As was shown before, the front brakes were missing the brake pads and the rear ones were on upside down. I know immediately that I will need to replace both sets. I also used my fine steel wool to lightly remove junk on the more difficult to remove painted surfaces. The corrosion and ever-present alkali on the brakes was a little more than I expected, but still manageable. A mineral spirit soak and Q-tip also helped to clean things up. From there, it was installing the brakes on the bike. I opted not to include the brake pads initially only because I prefer to have the wheels on to align the pads with the wheel rims. A little grease on the brake posts keep them supple and free. Strangely enough, the exact opposite is what is desired for the brake retention screws. They usually will have some lock thread or something to keep them from moving. Both the front and rear brakes went on without a hitch. The Tecto brakes are actually quite nice and not considered bargain brand. As is not very typical in one of my restoration projects, I opted to use a ready-made set of wheels I had from another bike. This set was because the original mismatched wheels didn't look good, and I reasoned they would look so much better than if I were to try and somehow resurrect the wheels to maintain the originality of the previous set. This set was actually a perfect candidate as a replacement set since it was an 8-speed sprocket, very close to the 7-speed original sprocket. I figured I would be able to get away with this since the chain width and overall dimensions are the same. These wheels are actually upscale Mavic rims paired with Shimano derailleur hubs, fitted with some Continental Town & Country wider MTB tires. Not a huge upgrade, but well within the quality of the original wheel set. I then attacked the chain. Since I saw it was rather corroded, I attempted to clean it and to see what the damage was. I did start cleaning with a wire brush, but shortly realized it was a lost cause, or at least not worth the effort to clean it the way I wanted it to turn out. I then decided to simply add a new chain that I had for these exact situations. Even then, I like to clean the new chain to remove the factory grease in favor of the dry lubrication I will apply later. Once clean, I checked my length on the bike, cutting the chain so that it wasn't too long when on the smallest gear on the sprocket and the smallest chain ring on the crank, as well as being able to accommodate the largest sprocket gear and chain ring. The length of the rear derailleur cage will determine the dimensions permitted for travel. Next were the brake levers, shifters, and handlebar grips installation. Because I moved to the 8-speed sprocket in the back, I decided to upgrade the brakes and shifters to something from a similar era. This is why I always keep a bunch of spare parts since I never know when I will need them and why. After sliding the brake levers onto the handlebars, I then added the shifters. These were some older Shimano 3x8 shifters that were used, but quite functional for this application. After loosely adding the brake levers and shifters, I added the new grips since the old ones were BMX grips and not designed for a mountain bike with shifters. That was why the guy had to cut notches in them so he could shift. I think the new grips will be a nice improvement. To install the new grips, a squirt or two of mineral spirits will allow slippage to get them on quickly before they start to grab the handlebar. From there, I sight the brake levers and shifters to more or less be in line with the angle of the hand of the rider, as to not create undue torsion or discomfort when trying to brake or shift, and tighten the bolts to hold everything in place. This is more of an adjustment done with the rider perched on the bike than what I can do from an initial installation attempt. With the wheels installed, now it was time to add the brake pads. Care must be taken to add them in a way that they will do the following. 1. Oriented with the correct direction of the pad with the front of the pad facing forward. 2. Strike the rim at a perpendicular angle. 3. Hit the full length of the pad at the same time. 4. Follow the contour of the rim. And 5. Does not make contact with the tire. All of this is difficult at times since the pads have 5 washers that fit around the brake before adding the nut. Many times I have dropped washers only to search for them and have to give up because they bounce everywhere. Furthermore, the pads are 3-dimensional and when tightening tend to twist. For this reason, I add the pad and will apply pressure on the pad against the rim as to keep it in place as much as possible when tightening the nut. Once I finished with the front brake, I added the brake cable guide and brake noodle. I grabbed a new brake cable and greased it up before threading it through the lever, guide, and noodle. I then pass it through the retention nut on the brake and adjust it for a little travel. I didn't like the length of the brake cable guide, so I decided to shorten it a couple inches. There are no hard and fast rules on the length, just that they are not too short as to not bind movement and are not too long to be floppy. Once reinstalled, I adjusted and clipped the extended cable with a cable end protector to keep from fraying. The rear brake is a repeat of the front brake in almost all aspects. I add the brake pads in the same fashion, the brake guides, and then the cable. The only real difference is that I add a ferrule on the exposed cable between the front and back of the bike to reduce cable slap when riding. Now for the final major component to install, the shifter and derailleur cables. These will follow the basic procedure of the bike cables. However, because they are buried in the shifters and not quite so exposed, they can be difficult at times. Each model and brand are different in their accessibility, but these were relatively simple. Shimano usually does a good job, but I have struggled at times with the cheaper models. The first thing I do is remove any leftover cable that may have stayed from the previous installation. I typically do not remove them immediately because it is easier to do so when installing the new cable. I only disassemble and reassemble once. Luckily, these did not have any remaining cables. Once I confirmed that nothing is hidden, I set the shifter to the lowest setting, or the setting with the most give in the shifter. That usually equates to the lowest cog on the sprocket or crank, depending on if it is the front or rear derailleur. This also exposes the channel that the cable needs to pass through the shifter. At times, I remove the shifter cover to better guide the cable. I usually check to see if the shifter is greased and correct if not. This model had a rubber plug that protects the access hole for the cable. Kudos to Shimano. Since I started on the front derailleur, I laced the derailleur cable and set it for the front. It was then that I realized I had made a rookie mistake. The front derailleur is controlled by the left hand and not the right, yet I did the opposite. You can see the frustration as I finally realized that. Luckily, I figured this out before I had gotten too far, but I am embarrassed to think that I lace shifters constantly and do not know where my head was this time. I pulled the cable back out and then moved it to the left shifter, adding the cable ferrule and set it on the front derailleur, making absolutely sure I did this one right, or left as I should say. I tightened the set screw and checked for functionality. As I was checking the functionality of the front derailleur, something snapped in the shifter and it suddenly didn't work as it should. I was hoping the shifter didn't break, so I removed the shifter from the handlebar and inspected it for anything I could see as wrong. After a little investigation, I realized the cable had somehow pulled through the retainer in the shifter. Now, this could be catastrophic or simply a misfeed that caused the issue. Luckily, as I inspected it further, I found I wouldn't need to replace both shifters to conserve the consistency. I just needed to refeed the cable through the shifter. Since I had it completely disassembled, I checked to see for any other issues. I verified the cable was clean and that it wouldn't pull through a second time. The reinstallation of the shifter and cable on the bike was routine. I then moved to the rear shifter and derailleur. At least by process of elimination, I can safely say I did this one correctly. Fortunately, this was relatively uneventful and went on as I would have expected. I fed the cable, added the ferrule, set the screw, checked for tension, and ran it through the different gears to confirm all 8 were firing as expected. So this was a great project and I'm happy with the results. This is how the bike turned out.
I gave it a test ride and the shifting was smooth. The tires rolled without issues and the fork bounced appropriately. The overall feel of the bike was great.